As a late ally to the Entente powers in the First World War, American reliance on French and British tanks throughout the closing days of the war came as a blessing in disguise. In 1917, General John J. Pershing set up a board to study the requirements needed for a new American tank. But a series of production complications and the armistice of 1918 left the US stuck with manufacturing a French design. These licensed-built Renault FT-17s became the optimal basis for the American 6-ton M1917. French steel-rimmed wooden idler wheels were changed to all-metal parts. The original engine was replaced with a 4-cylinder water-cooled design by Budo Engine Company, and it was armed with the Marlin Rockwell M1917 machine gun, then later Browning M1919. This design became an active part of US military experiments over the interwar period. These tests involved exercises in weapons deployment, terrain maneuvering, and modern communication trials. M1917s continued to be used in training exercises up to the late 1930s, before being sold off to neighboring allies in Canada by 1940. It was during this interwar period that military review bureaus began collaborating with companies such as Ford Motor Company and Chrysler Corporation to help fast-track development of new light and heavy tanks. It was only in 1935 that the fruit of their labor came to light with the introduction of the finalized light tank M2A1. Neatly addressing all requirements for speed and mobility, the M2A1 was fitted with a Continental radial aircraft engine, which provided enough power for the tank to sustain on-road speed of over 72 kilometers or 44 miles per hour. The M2A1's operational range could reach up to 190 kilometers or 118 miles with road access available. By the late 1930s, the M2A3 and A4 variants were in production and continued to be used sparingly in the Pacific Theater, while the remaining vehicles did their duty as training tanks. The early period of the Second World War saw a growing priority for a medium tank, something that would need to counter Axis armor designs active in Europe. This resulted in the medium tank M2. Standardized in 1939, the M2 featured the much-requested 37mm M5 gun, along with 8 multi-turreted 30 cal Browning machine guns. The M2's armor was a substantial increase from the light tanks currently being fielded, ranging from 9.5 to 25mm. To transport the added weight, a Wright air-cooled radial engine was fitted, allowing for the M2 to reach on-road speeds of 42 kilometers or 26 miles per hour. Initially, there was a major push to include these tanks in the newly formed armored force under Major General Adna Chaffee in 1940, but the facilities at Rock Island Arsenal were unable to meet the demand. By August 1940, even the M2A1 contract with Chrysler Corporation was canceled due to the new demand for a tank with a larger armament. Ultimately, the M2 would be used for training purposes only. While the American medium tank program floundered, improvements continued to be made in the light class category of tanks with the arrival of the light tank M3, known as the Stuart. While retaining the 37mm gun from the M2A4, the Stuart featured improved armor. With around 4,526 accounted for in total, many of these early production Stuarts would see themselves shipped off through Lend-Lease programs throughout the war, and even as surplus post-war. US tank development progressed with a renewed sense of urgency after the fall of France in 1940. The success of the German Blitzkrieg proved that a new era of armored warfare had arrived, and the US needed to adapt or die. With virtually no time for testing, the M3 Lee was quickly pushed into full-scale production. The M3's most important feature was the 75mm M2 and later M3 gun, capable of easily penetrating contemporary German tanks at almost any range. However, the rushed production meant that the gun had to be awkwardly mounted in the hull, while the cramped turret was fitted with a 37mm gun instead. While a true Frankenstein of design, the early production model still managed to produce over 6,200 units, with some serving until the very end of the war in the Pacific Theater. Building on lessons learned from the M3, the Ordnance Department quickly moved to create a new tank that could feasibly mount the large 75mm gun in the turret. This was the medium tank M4A1, best known as the Sherman. Set in an M34 mount, the same M3 gun used on the Lee could now traverse a full 360 degrees, letting the Sherman engage targets in any direction. By this point, the US had finally abandoned the cult of the machine gun, leaving the M4A1 with just 2 light and 1 heavy MG. The maximum armor thickness was increased to 63mm, with a top speed of 35 kilometers or 21 miles per hour, thanks to the Wright R975 radial engine. With over 6,281 models of the M4A1 alone produced, the Sherman remained an active part of all Allied armies throughout the Second World War, with some even being used in the Korean War. With the success of the newly formed M4 Shermans and ongoing M3A4 Stuarts, the demand for air-cooled radial engines forced the Army Ordnance to explore alternatives. Prototype designs began in November of 1941, using the standard M3 Stuart housing over a newer twin Cadillac V8 engine configuration. After successful trials, the new light tank M5 began production in April 1942. The new engine required the interior space to be increased and many components altered, but the M5 retained speeds of 38 kilometers or 23 miles per hour on road, with an operational range of 160 kilometers or 100 miles. Other additions, like the Hydra-matic automatic transmissions, simplified crew training in the field. The M5 and later M5A1 variant would replace the earlier M3 light tank across the US Army, continuing to be used as the first line of equipment over the course of the Second World War. While the Sherman and Stuart proved successful, the same could not be said of the American Heavy Tank Project. Born out of initial requirements set by the Chief of Infantry Courtney Hodges in 1940, initial prototyping ran into a series of difficulties which required project oversight from the Society of Automotive Engineers. Finally, after a period of tests and trials with the T1 model, the Ordnance Department contracted Baldwin Locomotive Works to begin production of the standardized heavy tank M6 in December 1942. The vehicle was armed with a 3-inch or 76mm M7 gun, alongside a coaxial 37mm gun in the turret, with two 50 cal and two 30 cal Browning machine guns. Despite weighing nearly 60 tons and featuring up to 101mm of armor, the 960 horsepower Wright G200 radial gasoline engine allowed the M6 an on-road speed of 35 kilometers or 21 miles per hour. Unfortunately, the M6 was let down by several complications, and its armament was considered underpowered by its introduction in 1942. Due to these problems, the M6 was deemed unfit for active service and never left the working prototype stage. By 1944, American forces were involved in numerous theaters of war, having fought in North Africa, the Mediterranean, Western Europe, and the Pacific. As these theaters progressed, so did technology, with the United States primarily focusing on improving their tried and tested designs rather than shipping whole new ones across the globe. With D-Day drawing near, there was a clear need for a heavily armored assault vehicle. Army ground forces in particular were keen to get the ball rolling, and suggested the modification of existing designs to better fit the desired role. By March of 1944, the procurement of such a vehicle resulted in the newly designed M4A3E2 Sherman, or Jumbo, as they were unofficially referred to in the field. Based on the M4A3 Sherman, the Jumbo featured new armored plates welded to the front hull and side sponsons. The final drive house was also given a new casting, made thicker by a maximum of roughly 140 millimeters. On top of this, the turret's gun shield also had its armor extended to a maximum of 178 millimeters. After production with Fisher Tank Arsenal ended in July 1944, the tanks proved successful in tests at Fort Knox and the Aberdeen Proving Grounds, and were shipped off to the European front by fall. Their effectiveness on the front lines would go on to expand military interest in applying heavier assault tank models for the remainder of the war. Alongside armor and firepower improvements from designs like the Jumbo, the US military were also pursuing changes to performance and reliability of existing models. One of the more successful variants to come out of these trials was the M4A3 76mm wet HVSS Sherman. As this was quite the mouthful, the tank was given a less formal nickname, the Easy 8. Besides the armor improvements, a more powerful Ford GAA engine, and a new 76mm gun, the Easy 8 introduced a wet ammunition stowage to reduce fires. The horizontal volute spring suspension system also provided a much smoother all-terrain performance. Thanks to all of these modifications, the Easy 8 was quickly recognized as an excellent tank even after the Second World War, finding common use in the Korean War against the T-34-85. As the Ordnance Department built and tested the T-20 series of medium tanks, the addition of heavier armor and a larger turret to hold the 90mm gun carried it over into the heavy class. By 1945, after years of difficulties, these efforts culminated in the M26 heavy tank, or Pershing. Although retaining the Sherman's general layout, many radical changes were introduced, resulting in a very different vehicle. The hull was simplified, which allowed for an armor thickness up to 100 to 110 millimeters around the front and gun shields, and a new Ford GAF V8 engine and torsion bar suspension were used to compensate for the new turret. Rolling out in 1945, the Pershing saw little action in the final months of the Second World War, though a notable engagement occurred during the offensive at Remagen. Despite its proven capabilities, the M26 still had many deficiencies, so it was developed further, leading to the Patton line of tanks. The end of the Second World War did not mean the end of American tank research and development. With new threats came a new desire for new armor, and continuous improvement of the tank platforms became a high priority throughout the Cold War. With the M26 Pershing's reclassification as a heavy tank in 1946, the desires to improve on its design led to the creation of the M46 Patton. The M46 was based on the standard M26 design, retaining the turret and forward hull structure as well as the machine gun. Improvements were also made to the tank's reliability. A stronger V12 engine, cross-drive transmission, a better power pack, and restructured exhaust system gave the M46 much better performance in the field. Along with the 800 initial models, an extra 360 variations were manufactured, based off of the Dozer, M46A1, and M46E1 variants. All of these saw action primarily during the Korean War, before their eventual replacement. In December 1960, a combined production effort between Detroit Tank Arsenal and Chrysler Corporation led to the M60, fitted with a 105mm M68 gun. The long length of the barrel provided opportunities for engagement over longer distances, and the addition of more modern targeting instruments increased accuracy. The combination of smart design and lighter materials, such as the interchangeable aluminum wheels and the supercharged diesel engine, gave the M60 both impressive speed and a larger operational range. Despite the early model M60 carrying their own problems relating to armor and shock absorption, they were still in active service throughout the 1960s and 1970s, serving alongside the M48 and later variant M60s in Vietnam and even the Gulf War. The limitations of the M41 Walker Bulldog left the Ordnance Corps ready to update their light tank capabilities. In 1966, the Allison Division of General Motors began building the 152mm gun launcher armored reconnaissance or airborne assault vehicle designated as the M551 or Sheridan. Its main gun, the 152mm M81, was very technologically advanced but required modifications like a bore evacuator to deal with leftover fumes. Not only were regular munitions available, but M51 Sheridan missiles could also be fired from the Sheridan's main cannon as long-range guided anti-tank weapons. But early production Sheridans with the M81E1 gun also had trouble with barrel wear, as the extreme stress from the ammunition caused cracks at the muzzle end of the missile keyway, leaving the maximum rounds available under 200. This was fixed in later modifications of the gun, allowing for a safe tube life of 600 rounds. The Sheridan saw combat in Vietnam and the invasion of Panama, but only used its Sheridan missiles in combat during Desert Storm, 6 years before they were withdrawn from service with no replacement. The late Cold War saw the US military collaborating with Western Germany on a joint research project known as the MBT-70 program, which sought to provide NATO with a main battle tank capable of countering the new Warsaw Pact designs. Although the MBT-70 project would be dissolved in early 1971, the United States would use it as a springboard to develop the 105mm gun tank M1, designated Abrams. The M1 featured a new type of composite armor built in a specific profile, designed to maximize crew survivability, as well as the namesake M68A1 105mm gun, which gave it considerable firepower. Normally, such a tank would be weighed down by this combination of armor and gunnery, but the Abrams' extremely powerful Honeywell gas turbine engine could put out 1,500 horsepower, giving the Abrams a maximum cruising speed of 68 kilometers or 42 miles per hour on road. The M1 Abrams rolled out in service in 1980, joining the new era of modern battle tanks emerging throughout the world, similar to the German Leopard and Soviet T-80. As the Cold War reached its final stages, the United States focused its energies on improving and developing the M1 platform. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 did little to lessen American interest in tank development, and the M1 remained central to the US military's arsenal. By 1992, a series of existing variants of the original M1 led to the introduction of a heavier variant known as the 120mm gun tank M1A2. Improving over the M1 Abrams gun, the M1A2 saw the replacement of an M256 120mm gun, which increased overall weight. Improved internal components, armor, and other combat systems were also included to ensure the tank was kept up to scratch. Outside of general upgrades, the M1A2 also had specific improvements added based on its service, with a major example being the addition of the Tank Urban Survival Kit, which was included for use in the urban conditions of the Middle East. A series of advanced weapon systems were also added over time, like the Crew Remote Operated Weapon System or Continuous Electronic Enhancement Program, all necessary to ensure the effectiveness and crew survivability it was intended for. While initially introduced in 1992, the M1A2 has seen various improvements, leading up to its current M1A2 SEP V3 model. While there have been proposals for an M1A3 variant, a number of delays has led to the M1A2 SEP V4 being the only developmental model ready for testing.